So welcome everybody. We've reached the last lecture for this year, before the summer. We would like to present Professor Jan Bill from the University of Oslo, the Cultural Museum in Oslo. This is a part of a series on Vikings that we had, and the continuation of a conference. Oh, sorry, I think I'll take my mask. The continuation of a very successful conference 3 years ago on Vikings and their presence in the Mediterranean. So we thought of creating a series of lectures together with the other Nordic institutes, the Danish, the Finnish, the Swedish, and the Norwegian. You know the institute. For those that haven't been here, I just want to add a sentence. It's a restructured institute, starting with the University of Bergen as the sole owner from 2021, and the University of Oslo as a very kind supporter of our activities. Follow us on Facebook, all the social media. We will be having more activities, a newsletter from next year, hopefully, so we will be able to disseminate what we're doing here. And thank you all for joining us. Paschalis, you can introduce.
I'd also like to welcome you all to our lecture tonight. It is my great pleasure to introduce our speaker, Professor Jan Bill, one of the most prominent figures in the field of Viking archaeology today. Jan Bill is a professor of Viking Age archaeology at the University of Oslo and curator of the Viking ship collection at the Museum of Cultural History. He's currently involved under different roles and capacities in setting up of the new collection at the new Viking Age Museum at the Museum of Cultural History. Professor Jan Bill's research interests touch upon a wide range of topics within the Viking Age and medieval archaeology. Most notably, his interests focus on Viking seafaring and burial archaeology, and specifically with the interpretation of Norwegian ship burials. Today's lecture combines the above interests by discussing practical and symbolic aspects and use of Viking ships. For this and other relevant topics, Professor Jan Bill has produced many articles, books, and also numerous book chapters. Apart from the too numerous to mention in detail publications, Professor Jan Bill has also collaborated with and directed many research projects, such as the Gokstad Revitalized project, which restudied the context and the surroundings of the Gokstad ship burial, the largest known Viking Age ship burial so far. Finally, the application of scientific methods, which also informs his academic agenda, brought Professor Jan Bill as a collaborator in projects applying DNA and genomics, genomic studies to interpret Viking mobility patterns and their effect on biodiversity. We could go on with Professor Jan Bill's academic achievements, but I guess it is better to pass the microphone. So let's welcome Professor Jan Bill and thank him for being here with us today.
Well, thank you very much, and thank you indeed for the invitation to come here and speak, and perhaps also discuss with such a distinguished group of people. I think that it's fair to say that the paper I'm presenting today is part of a process. It's not something that I have been studying for many years and now I'm presenting results. It's more like a bit of a new field that I'm trying to enter into. Of course, to some extent based on what I've been working with before. So you can consider this a kind of development work that we are hopefully undertaking together. I think it's obvious for most people who have heard about the Viking Age that the ships are kind of the epitome of that period of time. That is what we all what comes to the mind of us all when we're thinking about the Viking Age, and this is of course not for unknown reasons. Already the early medieval scholars and high medieval scholars were stressing the importance of the Viking ships for the expansion of the Scandinavians and for their piracy and plunder back in the preceding centuries. So, as an important cultural phenomenon, the Viking ships really has a very long history. However, for a very long time, their actual appearance was only known from quite biased and special textual sources and the occasional manuscript illustration or crude tombstone carving, and not very much was really known about how the Viking ships looked. It was not until the second half of the 19th century when preserved Viking ships started to appear through archaeology, starting in 1852 with the Boer ship, and then going on Tuna ship in 1867, and then finally the Gokstad ship in 1880, which was actually the first example of a almost completely preserved Viking ship, which of course gave a huge boost for the research into this field. What was clear, of course, during the excavation of these finds were that they were burial finds. These were ships that had not sunk, but ships that had been buried under big burial mounds with grave chamber, as you can see here. However, it was not really that facet of the finds that interested scholars back in those days. It was very much the question to try to figure out how the Viking ships would fit into some kind of ship historical evolution. That was in the center of interest, and it actually stayed so for quite a long time. Still up in the 1950s, that was the main topic that was discussed concerning the ships. Not the only, of course, but then things started to happen as ship finds were made elsewhere and in other contexts, and from slightly later periods. The ship burials, they dated back to the 9th and 10th century. Here we have a find site from the 11th century, where 5 late Viking Age ships had been deliberately sunk to block the sea route down to Roskilde, which was at that time the royal seat in Denmark. But still, with this new material, the focus remained very much on technology. It was expanding from trying to place the Viking ships in some kind of ship history into more technological aspects. How were these ships being built? How were they? How would you sail them? What was their capacities, and so on. An important person in this context was Ole Krummen Petersen, who some of you might have known. He was my director during many years, from I studied archaeology and until I had finished my PhD at the Center for Maritime Archaeology in Roskilde. The research that started out with the Skulderlev finds, with a very careful documentation and reconstruction process and so on and so forth, kind of culminated in the from the 80s on, when ship research, Viking ship research, started to be not only a question of working with the archaeological material, but also trying to make scientific reconstructions of the ships and sailing them in order to understand what these ships could. And actually this was the first of the scientific reconstructions that were, and replicas that were built in Roskilde, and that was also more or less my entry into archaeology, because I was part of that group of youngsters who was building that ship back in those days, so that was a lot of fun. However, at the same time something else started to happen, and that was that more focus came on the burial context of many of these ships, and also on the very numerous boat graves, that is, burials with small boats, inhumation and cremation burials, which were known from many parts of Scandinavia. Here I have a map which you unfortunately cannot see. Well, kind of. It's 50 years old, and already back then, in 1969, there were more than 400 known ship burials from Scandinavia, and places where the Scandinavians went during the Viking Age. Today there are many more, but at that time that was the number, and that is excluded a lot of burials like this, which clearly are symbolically using ships as motive in the burials, but not necessarily with actual boats in them. So altogether, today we might rather think of 1,000 or more boat graves, and we have also been able to expand their presence into Russia, Estonia, more here in Scotland, more in Iceland, and even in the last years we started to see boat graves popping up along the south and north sea shore. So we are really looking at a very widespread phenomenon. More recently, it has been suggested that, I should say that over the last 50 years since Müller-Wille made the study that I presented before, there has been more or less of a common ground that ship burials, boat burials was basically an expression of a fertility cult associated with the god Frey from the Norse mythology, and that the ships were kind of representing part of a circular cosmology where everything had to die to rise again. In later years, more voices have started to discuss this and suggested that perhaps not all graves that are using ship symbolism would necessarily have to be addressing exactly this idea, and that there could be other motives at play. And this is perhaps the one illustration that makes that visible. This is the yelling monument, and I'll just take a second to explain it. In its bottom, it consists of a stone setting in a ship shape, and it's marked out here in the landscape with these white concrete pads that are lying out there. It is big. It's really big. It's more than 350 meters long. So it's definitely much bigger than any other that we know of. In the center of this ship setting is a large burial mound that has been dendrodated to shortly after the middle of the 10th century. And it's believed to have been the burial mound for King Gorm, who was the father of Harald Bluetooth, the king responsible for this monument. A further mound, also extremely big, was situated down here, and around the whole thing, a large, very massive palisade was being built, turning that all into a sacred area, and some buildings were attached here. From the Rune Stones on this side, we know that this monument was the place was first monumentalized by Gorm the Old, who raised a rune stone over his wife here, and then Harald Bluetooth raised the famous yelling rune stone, which is actually right here, claiming that raising it over his father and his brother, and claiming that he Christianized Denmark and made and incorporated Norway into Denmark as well. So he was a very powerful king, which we can also see in the Danish landscape, because he did a lot of construction works, large fortresses, circular fortresses, which are today found both in Jutland, northern Jutland, it's found in Sealand and Funen, it's found in Scania, so it was kind of controlling his entire Denmark. Now the reason that I'm talking so much about this particular monument is that the Danish kings later claimed that they were descendants of a mythical King Skjold, King Shield, and this King Shield we know from Beowulf, which is an Anglo-Saxon poem, apparently based upon an older Scandinavian or Norse poem, and in the beginning of that poem, which is about Beowulf, a hero, we get an introduction to the Danish royal house at the time when this poem was playing out, so to speak. And the story about this King Skjold goes like this: that one day a boat was drifting off on a shore in the kingdom of the Danes, and in that boat there was beautiful weapons and a big shield, and on that shield there was a baby boy resting, and there were nobody else in the boat, so he was alone. So he was brought to the Danish king and brought up by him, and of course became the new king when the old king died one day. So this is, of course, a foundation myth. This is a new bloodline that is getting at the throne, and this is an explanation why this happened. The Beowulf poem further tells us that as this new king, who was dubbed Skjold from being found on a skjold, on a shield, when he realized that he was soon going to die, then he ordered his followers to take his dead body when he was dead and put it into a ship, or onto a ship, and it should not be any less beautiful with objects, weapons, and all that kind of things than the boat was which once had brought him to the Danes, and then they should just push the ship out on the water, and then it would sail away of itself, and so they did, and this happened, and then the poem it asks kind of who knows who is going to receive this ship with this cargo. Snorre, writing in another context, is saying that this boat is going to Odin, of course. So, if this is the same myth that the Danish kings are referring to some 100 years later, then we do understand why a ship was a big stone ship was an appropriate basis for this entire royal monument, because it was the symbol of King Skjold, and thereby demonstrating that he was the ancestor of the royal Danish line. I've myself argued that that this use of the Skildinger myth, as it's called, do not necessarily have to be restricted to Denmark. It could actually also be something that had inspired the Norwegian ship burials. So maybe when we are looking at boat and ship burials, this is kind of additional layer coming upon whatever meaning the ordinary boat burials might have. And it is to be noted that they have a much older history than these very huge ship burials. You can find boat burials in Denmark back to the Mythologic, actually, or Neolithic. Not continuously, of course, but you have it there. You have it in the Bronze Age. You have it during the Iron Age from the 1st century AD, and then more or less continuously up to the Viking Age and through the Viking Age. Now, so this is actually these two different angles on ships from the Viking Age that I want to explore with this paper. I want to try to see if we can realize any kind of connection between the two, between the real ships and the symbolic ships, and to see if there perhaps is some kind of influences back and forth between these two types of ships, the ship burials, the ships as they are represented in myth and in the cosmology, and then the real ships. What would that take? That would take that we looked at the ships not just as functional objects, not just a tool of transport, but perhaps also looking at them as something which inherently had this kind of mythical dimension, that they always would have that potential of being something related to the cosmology. And that is what I will try to explain or try to investigate. And keywords here is to look for ships and boats that are not simply functional, but also looking at them as objects that were having agency, objects that were animated. That means objects that were meant to influence people and the world around them. Like, for example, this big stone ship here is clearly made in order to influence everybody that sees it to understand why the Danish royal family could be exactly that. But since we are here, I thought I would try and take another example of an animated ship, namely Argo. And here I know that I'm stepping into your fields and so you can tell me if I'm saying something completely crap. But what is so fascinating about the story about Argo, that is, of course, it's pure myth, but it is a very good example of an animated thing. Not only is it favored by the gods, but Athena is actually involved in teaching how the ship shall be built, how the sails shall be used, and the whole thing is, of course, because the ship is a very important tool for Jason to actually retrieve the golden fleece and become king. So it's really a godly investment in the ship in order to ensure that the right person is going to take over the throne. And then it has a fantastic dimension also, I think, in the sense that it is that the ship is actually so closely associated with the gods that when it is not anymore in use, it is actually disappearing from Earth and becomes a celestial body in the sky, which I think is a very beautiful picture of how a ship can be so much more than a ship, at least in the myth. But that it also could be so in Scandinavia, or among Scandinavians at least, or among the Normans, if we should be very accurate, I think is illustrated very well with this this scene from the Bayeux Tapestry. This is, of course, after the Viking Age. The tapestry was produced around 1070. And what we do see here is the invading fleet of William. And here they have landed on the beach at Hastings. Horses are getting on land, and here the ships have been pulled up on land. The interesting thing here is that when these ships are sailing, many of them have these figureheads on, but when they come to land, they take them off. The explanation for that we can find in an Icelandic law text, the Grey Goose, which is a compilation, but parts of it is believed to to go back to the 10th century, before Christianity came to Iceland, and one of the sections in the text are instructing sailors that when they are closing into land to Iceland, then they have to take off the figureheads of their ships, because otherwise the figureheads will scare the spirits of the land. So it was apparently not only is that something that Wilhelm was thinking of, or his sailors. This was something that also Icelanders in 10th century and later on were thinking of. So obviously it was expected that if the ships would come close to land with figureheads on, that would be a bad omen for whatever you wanted to do. So the ships had agency, or the figureheads at least had agency. I have looked a little bit around for the mythological ships that we know from the textual sources from the northern world. I just put up Argo here for just for the fun of it. But we have 3 ships that we can associate with the mythology, and which are all mentioned in poetry that goes back to the Viking Age. So it's not just something that is mentioned in later sources, but actually also in poetry. The first one then is the Skildbladnir. Skildbladnir that means as much as something which is built of many pieces of thin wood. And Skildbladnir was built according to the poetry by dwarves or elves on demand by the god Loki, but it was built for Freya, and this is where we have this fertility connection coming in. So it has this supernatural. There's no humans building it, of course. It's happening in the world of the god Asgard. It has some supernatural qualities. It always finds a good wind when the sails are hoisted, and can go everywhere, over land or on the water, and then can be folded together and put in your pocket. So it reminds a little bit about some of the qualities of the Argo. Superfunctional is a term I've put in here just to try to describe how is it something special in terms of what ships are usually doing and how it has been built and so on. So it was a very well built ship, the best built. And what could it do for the gods? Well, it could take all the gods on board with all their weapons and transport them wherever they wanted to. So this was clearly a ship with a very, very big potential. We do, however, not learn anything about when it is actually being used. So that's, of course, sad. Then there's another ship called Nalfa, which is an interesting one. What we do know is that it belongs to one of the death realms, Muspel, the realm of fire. So it is connected with that. It is also said to be the largest of all ships, and it has a function. When the world is going to break down, the event of Ragnarok, when everything is destroyed, it is actually going to bring the army of the evil god Loki to the battle. So it has a very important role there, kind of guaranteeing that Ragnarok appears. And although this sounds terrible, then I think it's important to realize that the cosmology of the Scandinavians at that time was a circular one, so that the world as the Scandinavians knew it would break down and disappear was a necessity in order for a new world to begin. So in that sense it was something that had to happen. Then there is some etymological problems about the name, because it's very often understood as a ship made of nails, and certainly in the medieval sources we learn about how it is built of the unshaved nails of the dead people, so everybody had to watch that their nails were not too long and things like that. But this might well be a mistake. It might there's a word called dader, and that simply means death, and it's quite likely with all the things that it's related to that it was actually simply a death ship, and that this was a ship that was important also for bringing the deceased people to the death throes. So if we go down further, then we have ringhorni, which means as much as stems with rings on them, and that is owned by the god Balder. Again, the largest of all ships. It is actually being used, and that's why we know it, for the burial of Balder. Balder is the only god that dies before Ragnarok, and when he is being cremated, this is happening in his ship, and that's why we know about it. And then we have Ringhorni happens also to be the name of the ship on which Skuld, that I mentioned before, was being buried. So what we do see is that, well, we do not have a lot of mythological ships, but they have important roles. They are very connected with the gods. They certainly are objects of very big importance and objects with a lot of agency. If we now turn away from the mythological world and look at the ships that historically are supposed to have existed, then the list is very short. Actually, what we have of ships with names, and it's all from around year 1000. So it's in a period where Christianity has a good hold in many parts of Scandinavia. But I think it's interesting to look at it for the sake of investigating whether these ships could be considered animated, were they alive, and when things get a specific name that only they have, that tends to be a signal that these ships are regarded as animated in one sense or another. And here we have them, ornament that's snake or serpent, so that's a long serpent. Then we have a crane here, we have a shorter serpent. So these are like animals. There's a bison down here as well. And then we have one which is called bardi. That's a constructional feature, a certain type of stem post. And karlhöfti, which basically means head of Karl. And it might reflect that it had a figurehead which was supposed to be to look like the head of Charlemagne, who was of course the big ideal at that time. So that was what we could find in, again, the Viking Age poems of ships that we might consider animated, although it's real ship, it's not mythological ones. Then in the poetry, there's a lot of metaphors used about ships, and I listed them up here. We're not going through all of them, but it's mainly horses here, and elk. There's a dragon down here. Then there are, of course, the snakes again, very prominent. Here it's more skis and sledges, and here we have again constructional elements from the ship. So although this is not names, then it's still helping us getting an insight in how the ships were considered being animated. They were likened with animals. They were likened with special possibilities like skiing over the water and things like that. Now, if we are now going to the actual ship finds, then the material is much less, but very interesting. This is the original top of the stem of the Oslo ship, and I'm sure that you can all see what it is. 2 eyes here, and then a head and a body that goes around like this and then continues down and becomes the whole ship. So here we actually see the serpent or the swarna that we read about in the poem, in the poetry. This particular ship was a snake. It was a serpent. It was made to look like that. The Oslo ship, which was excavated in 1904, is extremely well preserved. The reason that the stem top here was preserved was actually that it was cut down by grave robber, so it came down below the groundwater table. So we can be happy for that. The ship itself was built in 820, and it was used as a burial ship 14 years later in a completely different part of Norway from where it had been built. So this is a real ship. It is a ship that has been sailing, and as it was sailing as a snake. So this again is an example where we can suppose that the ship was actually considered animated. There's a little bit of evidence more. This is another ship burial from Denmark, the Ladby ship, dated to around 925, so the ship might well have been built around 900. When it was excavated, there was this series of spirals found on the top of where one stem post has been. They were not quite as nicely situated as here, but it was very clear that they had been sitting on some kind of stem head, and it could be a horse. It could also have been, like we can see here on this small mold here from Birka, and this amulet from the same place. It could also be perhaps a more of a dragon-like animal, or perhaps even some kind of snake, although I have never heard about snakes with hair. So here again, this was a longship, a warship, and here we see that it is given this attribute. The last archaeological example is from Brittany in western France, and very uncertain, but it is a big, it's like something like this, ring-shaped ornament of iron, which was found in a ship burial. Unfortunately, this was a cremation burial, so we have no chance of knowing where it was sitting on the ship, if it was on the ship at all. But at least it is a possibility that it is actually representing such a stem post with a ring on it, a ring-horned ship. Moving on from here, we can take a look at the iconographic sources, and here we are first turning to Gotland, to the Gotlandic picture stones, ones that are dated from around 700 and up into the 10th century. And here we see ships. Now this is very hard to see for you, but here we actually have a spiral, so we can assume that this is a snake. The same thing up here. Here we have something different. This is clearly some kind of animal head, although we really can't say what it is. And here we have a couple of spirals again, and we can see that they are important because the artist has actually cut out from the sail in order to make it clearly visible, that so that the spectator will see it. If we are looking at this one, we might just have a ring stem, although it's hard to say with these carvings. We also have some rune stones from eastern Scandinavia, from Scania and Denmark, with ship depictions. Here, I think it might be a horse because of the ears that's standing there, the eyes on the side, and this very big part of the chin sitting here. If we are moving on to another medium, we can look at the coins. The Viking Age was when coins first were minted in Scandinavia, and what we're looking at here is the coins minted in Hedeby from around 825 and some decades forward. And we see there are ships which have not really anything that we can understand on the stems. Could be perhaps a ring, but it's hard to say. But here we have a couple of very nice horses here, and over here we have something that looks like rings very clearly. So when we're looking at the motives of these tombstones, as they are both the rune stones and the other part, we are within the themes that we have already recognized from the literary sources. That it's not that we have completely different pictures here. We find the same thing. When we're going to the to this graffiti, that's a little bit more mixed. Here we have a deer, a stem head. Over here we have a spiral stem, so that's probably a snake, and the same goes from this graffiti, which is on an object from the Oslo burial, so that's perhaps not so surprising, since the ship itself had something like that as well. So if we're trying to draw together this information, I think what appears is that, well, okay, we find quite a lot of serpents in many different situations, but then it's also noticeable that we have quite a lot of sources that indicates that construction somehow is part of making the ships animated. It means something to say that a ship is a bardi, which is referring to the stem shape, it means something to say that it's made of oak and all that kind of things. So we'll just keep that a little bit in mind. And now we shall try to explore a little bit more into what the ships might tell us indirectly. Here we are looking at a couple of reconstructions of small boats that from the Viking Age, and what I want to show with this is that even such small vessels, which have not been of great importance, they are built with exactly the same care, with exactly the same high aesthetical standards, high technical standards as the bigger ships. Try and look at this stem post here from this small boat, and then we just look at a couple of archaeological examples. This one was found in a bucket, has never been used, but it was prepared to be used in a boat in Scotland at a Scandinavian settlement. Or here we are actually up in the 11th century, the Skundale 3 ship, the one that you saw as reconstruction before. Here you have the stem lying out here. Now all this is completely unnecessary. This is wood carving that you didn't need to do, because it's just lines that are carved into to a big piece of oak. But the idea is that these lines are just the beginning of the strakes, the planks that are going all the way through the ship and ends in the same way in the aft. So this is really an investment put into making these lines appear as they go from up here and all the way through the ship and back again. So they're kind of making streamlined vessels, although it doesn't have any practical importance. If we're looking into the Viking ships, and we find more of the same kind of thinking. Here we are looking into the Gokstad ship, and as you can see, it's really a very light construction. Now the deck planking has been removed, so we can look down into it here, but you can see it's very tiny timbers that are used for the frames here. It's not massive what is being used for the beams. It's all very widely spaced, a meter between each of the frames. So everything here is very, very lightly built. When you're looking at the frames, then they are actually not nailed to the ship. They are secured to these pieces of wood clamps that have been carved out of the planks, not just added to the plank, but carved out of the planks, and then it have been bound together so that you have a very flexible connection. So this whole ship construction is very light, extremely light, and it is very flexible, and a lot of effort has been put into camouflaging things like the joints between the planks along the length. This is how they are made in the Viking age ships, and this is how they come to be made later, a few centuries later, where you are greatly reducing the amount of work, but then you get very visible joints here. I just want to show you a close-up from the Oseberg ship. Here you are at one of the stems, have the carvings on the stems here, but here you can see how along each and every plank, and that also goes from many of the timbers inside the ship, you have these decorative moldings that have been made along the edges of the ship, so that the lines of the ship becomes extra visible. It's very important, apparently, that you are making your ship, that you are emphasizing these lines, that they're clearly visible to those who are looking at the ship. And this goes both for fantastic ships like the Oseberg ship, and it goes for each and every little boat that we find from that period. So it was clearly important. Just to make a little point here, the scarves I told you about before, and those up here, you can barely see them if you do not know where they are. And it's the same from the outside. It's so nicely done that it's just because of the iron nails that you can see them. There's no feeling them when you are bringing your hand over them. If we move up a little bit in time to the late 10th and early 11th century and look at this comparison here, then we have the real long ships here, the very long, very narrow ships, those which were meant for war use and for very little else, transport of soldiers we have over here. And here we have the cargo ships, which is a phenomenon that first starts to come around year 1000 in Scandinavia. Specialized vessels built for cargo transport. And what you see is that, okay, these are sturdier, but they are all built according to the same and pretty light system, and they are all still built with 1 meter in between the frames. So you can try to imagine if you are looking at a ship like this one, 36 meters long. When it was sailing in the water, it was just wiggling like that. The stem and the stern would be moving like that because it was so lightly constructed. And maybe that is a feature that we should really recognize as something important, because this is something that you would experience when you are sailing in the boat. So we have a series of features that are emphasizing how the ships are flexible, how they are streamlined, how they are looking natural. You don't have these visible joints and so on. Everything is smooth, and maybe that is because this was a kind of image in the mind of the shipbuilders at that time. The viper, as all snakes, it can swim. It is a little bit special in the sense that it's able to have very much of its body over the water. This is of course an animal that everybody in the Viking Age would know of, and I think there is some kind of connection between that we find so many snakes or serpents in the literary sources and the construction features that we see in the ships themselves, and then this animal. And really, if we are looking at the Osberg ship, we are looking at the whole thing really being one big serpent. It should be mentioned that the serpent is a kind of double-faced word in the Norse cosmology, because you can think of it like we have been doing here, but the big serpent is also one of the creatures that are fighting the gods on the day of Ragnarok, and the snake that we are knowing as the Midgard Snake, that is basically the snake of the world of man. Midgard, that is our world, that's where we live. That is surrounding the entire world in the ocean. So of course there's an obvious connection also between ships as snakes and this monster. Just to show the difference between Scandinavian shipbuilding in the 10th century and what we find, for example, in Anglo-Saxon England. I'll just show you this picture. Not very much left of this boat. but as you can see, it's very densely framed, only half a meter in between each, and the frames themselves are very massive. It's a completely different way of thinking a ship compared to what we know from Scandinavia. So maybe that the reason for the many boat graves in Scandinavia and the reason for the Scandinavian boats and ships being built in that very special way that they are is connected. And I would like to suggest, and I admit that my thinking here is not fully developed yet, but I would like to suggest that the reason that we keep on in Scandinavia, one of the reasons that we keep on in Scandinavia building these highly elaborate boats and ships, that is basically that it was always a part of the shipbuilder's mind and a part of the boat owner's mind that particular real boat that he or she would be using in real life, it might also one day be the one boat that should, just like the Ringhorny ship of King's Guild, that it should be the vessel that would bring them at least on the first part of the journey from the world of the living to the world of the dead. When we are looking at these descriptions in the textual sources, then we see that the journey from the living to the dead, that would generally include first a travel over water of some kind, and then a travel with a horse after that. And exactly that combination of boats and horses is something that we very often find in the graves. Well, that was my ideas. I'd be very happy to hear what you think about it, or any other questions that you might come up with. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor. Any questions?
I have a question. I understand these boats were built for one thing to be used as boats in the sea, right? And then these boats again had the purpose of being at one point in their lifetime a burial object. What was the decision? When would that be the time to bury them? Would it be because of somebody specific dying who would have to be in the boat like this, or was it when the boat was not faring well any longer and could not be used in the sea and then used as a burial object?
Yes, I think that the idea is more of each boat having the potential to be a boat that could transport you into the afterlife. Whether it happened for the specific boat or not would be a matter of, well, destiny, basically. So that, because when somebody died, then of course he or she had to be buried, and you couldn't just wait for ages with that. So you would have to take whatever boat would be available for it. And I do not doubt that it was if we can say it like that, an honor for a boat or a ship to be used as a grave vessel. And we can see, for example, the Osberg ship was specifically repaired ahead of it being used in the burial. It was repaired the same year as it was buried, actually. So you would do everything to make sure that this ship was fit for sailing. And I mean, that was obviously important, because if it was not, would it then be reliable? Would you actually come to your destination, or would you end up somewhere in between?
Thank you for a wonderful talk. I have two questions. First of all, do we have any evidence either from the Viking period or the period afterwards, about the naming of the ships, whether they were, I mean, whether the names were reserved for specific, particular important ships, or there is a tradition of naming all kinds of ships, because I'm assuming, you know, these big vessels that we see were used for a specific purpose, so there were all sorts of different size vessels being used for different purposes. And also, my second question is, who, especially when it comes to these long ships, they were presumably used in warfare or raiding, and some of them ended up in graves of powerful people, male or female. What was the do we know the ownership of the ship? Was it a communal effort, community owned the ship, or was a powerful individual who owned the ship?
Yes. To take the last question first, from what we know, ships were normally in private ownership. You could very well have a ship together with somebody else. We have examples on that described from Rune Stones. So you could be a group of people sharing a ship. When we are talking about the big ships, then we're probably talking about ships that are important as symbols of the power of persons, and then it would be the earl or the king or something like that that owned them. Concerning the question of names to the ship, I think it's very clear that not very many ships had formal names, since we learned so little about it from the textual sources. It's really very, very few examples that we have. But then I think that since some of these names are more names that are related to their construction, like the Bartje, for example, then I think that actually for people who were having a ship or a boat, or you know, they would call it the boat or the ship or whatever, but that would be a name for them, because they wouldn't like have 10 or 20. they would have that one, right? And if the boat in itself, through its construction, through the way that it has been carefully produced, have this kind of animation, then I think it will be the boat for that particular person, and in that sense it will have the same function as if it was called Orm or something like that. The ships that we have seen with names are definitely all ships that belongs to the absolutely top of the society, and these were ships that were famous, especially Ormenlange, the Long Serpent, and it's actually, the Long Serpent is actually the only ship where you are in the poetry finding an indication of it being animated in the sense that the ship has it is expressed in a way that you have to be worthy to the ship to enter it as a soldier there. It's not something for anybody. So you have very many different levels of this. The Oseberg ship, which was of course also from the top of the society, I'm very sure that was called something with Ormer when it had this particular stem. But of course, when we are looking at the pictorial sources, and especially the coins and the tombstones, the Gotlandic picture stones and so on, and see these motifs come again and again and again, then I also think that strengthens the idea that this is ships with a specific role. They have a certain function, a certain identity.
Any other questions? Yes, please.
Yes, thank you. Thank you. It was wonderful to hear of these. I certainly learned a lot. I was just thinking that I like this idea of the role of animals, and particularly as most of those animals, they seem to be somehow amphibian.
Mm-hmm.
And I was thinking that maybe this element of the boat sailing in the water, but also on the land, moving on the land, like in mythology, as you said, has some sort of a connection. Also, the way of thinking that animals, often in these mythologies, I have to admit I do not know Viking mythology so well, but animals are needed as a kind of a transport or aids to transfer humans between these border thingies of like life and death. And you would think that there's 3 layers of existence, and that is death, and then the existence, and maybe the sky.
Mm-hmm.
So humans cannot do it without animals, and often that's how it is. So there might be something for also this iconographical presence, or the form of the presence of certain types of animals there. I don't know.
Yes, I think that's a very good way of thinking of them. And there is actually a lot of research in Viking studies on the role of animals, different animals, in relation to both life and death. As I mentioned, well, if we would scroll back to the Gotlandic picture stones, we would also see how first you have in some cases the death scene, and then you'll have the ship, then you will have Odin's horse Sleipnir bringing the deceased the last piece of the way. But you also have in Norse cosmology, you have the importance of other animals like well, bears, of course, and also the male pig. I just lost the name. The boar. It is, yeah. So we also have it in fighting, and you have different roles, and many of them are reflected when you're looking in the mythology in the text. Then you'll find them having the same role as you see them having on metalworks and other places. I think then we also have Roseberg and Gox that are both examples of that. We have all these animals that are you can't say what it is. It's not meant that you should be able to say that this is a horse or this is something else. It's just animals, but they have 2 or 4 legs, so they might be birds or other animals. But they are very much populating everything, so that might bring in a little bit of confusion perhaps.
Professor Will, thank you. I suppose, although I missed more than half of your lecture, I suppose that the ships you have exposed were the noblest kind of shipbuilding, that is, sea riding ships throughout the Atlantic. What was of the ships that were following inland waterways?
Mm-hmm.
Because there was a very important Viking expansion towards the east,
Mm-hmm. That is right.
as far as today's Ukraine. I mean,
yeah. Well, we fortunately the Scandinavians, and especially those in Sweden, they tended to use cremation burials. So they left quite a lot of boat burials also in Russia and Ukraine.
Russia.
Yeah. So you can see that you have them going about as far as north of Volga, the Volcany, and then you have them going on the more westerly route over Kiev, about as far as down to Kiev or a little bit north of that. So my reading of that is perhaps that the Scandinavian used their own vessels or vessels that they built.
The same vessels that were
Yeah, in the Baltic. Yeah, but for the downstream journeys further down, they were actually rather using local boats that we do not have traces of, because they do not have iron in the same way. But I think it's important to point out that these boats that we find in the boat graves, they are, because there are variations, but not in the basic features. So they are clinker built with the iron rivets, and they are very light, and they are having the same kind of system for propulsion and so on. Of course, there must have been dugout canoes and things like that you would use on the lake for fishing and things like that. But it's they seem not to have been playing any important role in furniture in burial contexts, and we very seldom find them. So they might, for all I know, they could also have been the boats of slaves or whatever. They do not appear in the ritual connections or contexts. I think the smallest boats that we are finding for burials, I mean, they're not much more than 3 meters, 3.5 meters long or something like that. Still a clinker-built boat, even if it was paddled and not broken. It's built in the same way. So, and I think that's perhaps very telling that we have social differentiation, of course, but we have the same technology and we have the same aesthetics, and that's perhaps the important thing, that you maintain the same aesthetics the entire way through the at least the most parts of society.
Other questions?
Do you have any evidence of painting on these boats? For example, additional animal characteristics painted on them? Because, for example, in representations of on vessels of Greek ships, we see that they have eyes painted on them on the front.
Yeah.
So that makes them sort of more animate.
Yes, right. Well, we have very little preserved in terms of paint. I think that I just wanted to have this picture up here and then say on the Gokstad ship, that's the only one where we have really found evidence of paint. And what was found was on one strake, one plank, this not the uppermost one, but the next one, there was a pattern of triangles going along the entire strake, and it was painted then in black and yellow. Might have been black and white actually, just faded over the years. And I think that is actually perhaps also giving this impression of something snake-like. And then of course we have the Oslo ship. Oh, that goes a long way. There we go. We haven't been looking really at that, but here you have the snake, and then it splits up here, but from up here, and both down here and here, all the way down to below the waterline. This is actually animals that are connected to each other and fill up that whole thing there. So it's not only using the snake, it's also putting in 100 more of animals. But that's how the Viking Age is. You find that really on many things.
Other questions? No, so let us thank Professor Janvik for his wonderful lecture. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much for listening.